started to give Shanna as much time as possible. Welcome everyone to Crow Canyon's weekly Thursday webinar. I say that, but in fact, next week we're going to take a break for a week, the only week break during this year. But otherwise, we have these every Thursday. And today's webinar is titled Ute Rock Art in Southeast Utah, Identity and Land Use in a Rapidly Changing West. And our speaker is Shanna Diederichs. A few logistics about the talk. You can minimize the size of the talking heads and move that bar, pull it to the right, so the size of Shanna's presentation images is the biggest. There will be a live transcription on the bottom of the page that you can use in case you need it. Shanna will be taking questions, and we'll take those at the end of her talk, but you can type, if you look at the bar on your screen, there's a symbol that says Q&A, and if you click on that, you can type your questions in there, and we'll field those questions at the end of the talk. If you're having trouble with the Zoom link, you can head over to our live stream on our Facebook page at that address, crowcanyon.org/Facebook. Finally, you can subscribe to us on YouTube at that address. This is being blocked by my transcription on the bottom, but and what's really great is all of our webinars are on there, so you can look through it, find a subject that interests you, and tune in to all of those past webinars that you might have missed. Sorry, my thing's moving too fast. Here's a picture of Crow Canyon's campus with Ute Mountain, which is Ute Mountain Ute lands, the Ute Mountain Ute Indian Nation lands in the background. And our Crow Canyon's mission to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. And I really encourage you to check out our website because it has lots of information about all of those topics at www.crowcanyon.org. We want to begin with the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledging the Pueblo Ute, Paiute, Dene/Navajo, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our institution sits and upon which we work and reside. Our mission-related work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. And we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. Crow Canyon is so grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. We had a really generous donor who made a $50,000 challenge gift in 2021 to support these weekly webinars. Every dollar that you contribute in support of the Discover Archaeology webinar series will be matched up to $50,000. And you can see that we're just over $30,000 towards that goal. So please consider a donation that will be matched will be matched to help support this webinar series. And if you have any questions about that, just send us an email and we'll answer them for you. As I said, there's no webinar next week. It's the 1 week we're skipping this year. But the next two upcoming webinars are on Thursday, August 12th and Thursday, August 19th. As a really perfect complement to Shanna's webinar tonight, Ernest House Jr., a Ute Mountain Ute tribal member, will be talking about the Utes, Colorado's forgotten people. Ernest has had an incredibly distinguished career, including being the head of the Colorado Indian Commission, and he's moved on to another job now. And I'm sorry I don't have that title in front of you, but it's a really big scale job. He does amazing work for all Indigenous people. His webinar will be followed up the next week by another Indigenous archaeologist, a Dene Nation person, Wade Campbell, who grew up on Black Mesa. If you know that landform, it's in northern Arizona. And this is about his PhD research that he's doing, and it's titled Being Sheep-Minded, an ethno-archaeological study of Navajo pastoralism and its historical trajectory. So two really interesting Indigenous archaeology perspectives for our next two webinars. COVID continues to hit Indigenous communities hard, and any support you want to give to those communities is deeply appreciated. Here is a list of organizations that you can contribute to help the Four Corners area Indigenous nations. And this is a place where you might not have a pencil handy, but you can go back to the YouTube channel where this talk will be published tomorrow, and you can pull up this introduction, find this slide, and find these organizations and look at them and decide which one you want to contribute to. But those contributions are deeply appreciated by these communities. Okay, that's my introduction. We're getting ready to start our talk, Ute Rock Art in Southeast Utah, Identity, Land Use in a Rapidly Changing West by Shanna Diederichs. Shanna is a fourth generation Coloradoan, raised and shaped by the landscape and history of the West. I would also say, she didn't include this in her bio, but she's a former Crow Canyon employee and the director of our 6 or 7 year long Basket Maker Communities project, which was one of our most important research projects that we've conducted here at Crow Canyon. And that project actually became the basis for her earning her master's degree in anthropology at Northern Arizona University. Shanna currently works as an architectural conservator and archaeologist at Woods Canyon Archaeological Consultants, which I think it's fair to say is at least one of the premier archaeological consulting businesses in the Four Corners and the greater Southwest. Her current research focus is the breadth of Native American occupation in Southeast Utah, from its earliest inhabitants up to the present. And she also focuses on documenting the increasing damage being done to archaeological sites by the exponential increase in visitation that's occurred in the last decade, and coming up with solutions to that problem. With a broad background in research, site conservation, and public education, she aims to help people appreciate cultural landscapes and imagine the lived history of the West. Shanna, I'm going to stop my video, stop sharing my screen, and turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mark. Yeah, let me get this rolling. Thanks everybody for being here today. I really, Mark, I really appreciate you giving me the introduction. I haven't seen Mark in a long time, so it's an honor to be here with him. And I just want to say thank you to Edge of the Cedars. It's their actual lecture series that I was invited to by the Monticello BLM field office. So they were part of hosting this, which is an honor too, because I'm going to be speaking mostly about the work we've done in their area. So I'm going to share with you examples of Ute rock art recorded by Woods Canyon Archaeological Consultants over the last 5 years in Southeast Utah. And so highly adapted to the rugged landscape of the Intermountain West, the Ute people have lived in Southeast Utah for at least 7 centuries. With little other cultural remains left behind by the Ute, rock art is an extraordinary record of their historical experience and their adaptability in a rapidly changing West. So I'll unpack that a little bit more as we go. So I'm going to give a quick background on the Ute, just so we're all on the same page. when the Spanish encountered them in the mid-1500s, the Utes had already had an immense territory stretching from the Western Great Basin to the mountains and valleys of central Utah, into northern New Mexico, and both sides of the Rockies in Colorado. Basically, their full historic territory, except for maybe the plains, which they spread onto a little bit later. So the Utes are believed to have developed as a distinct people around 1000 AD in the southern part of the Great Basin, an area roughly located in on the southern border between California and Nevada. As they expanded this early Utes, they were connected by their southern Numic language. So that's a branch of Uto-Aztecan language family. And while there are regional differences in Ute speech, all dialects are mutually intelligible. And this really implies that even though they covered a huge territory, they were part of a single speech community and had many overlapping social networks throughout their history. So Ute people migrated into the Four Corners region by at least the 14th century AD. So there's quite a bit of research documenting that at this point. So there was a loose confederation of about 13 bands by the 17th century, and that's basically what's shown on this map. And there was a population of about 10,000 people. Ute bands really had very fluid membership and a high mobility. And while different bands may have passed through and even frequented Southeast Utah, I have to say that it was and still is known as both Sabwagana and Weenooch Ute territory. And that's what we refer to now as sort of the Uncompahgre Ute and the Wimminooch Ute. So by the 1890s, these amalgamated bands were really pushed onto 3 distinct reservations in eastern Utah and southwestern Colorado. The Wimminooch were assigned to the Ute Mountain Ute Reservation in southwest Colorado and some of the allotted lands on White Mesa over in southeast Utah, and some allotted properties in Cottonwood Canyon in southeast Utah. So just so everybody knows, I'm going to be using photographs that I've borrowed from the Denver Public Library just to highlight what we're talking about. And what you're seeing here is a Ute camp and horsemen near Toyoak, Colorado, which is just outside of Cortez here. So Woods Canyon, our archaeological consultants, which is where I am out of and what I'm a staff archaeologist there. We've surveyed over 2,100 acres in a portion of Wimminooch territory in San Juan County, Utah. We've recorded 1,700 sites, and this map shows projects in the western half of that county, basically west of Highway 89, which runs from Bluff to Monticello, and then onto Moab to the north. So the archaeology, to give you an idea, is extremely dense in this region, with about an average of 1 site for every 10 acres. So the summary of what I'm going to be doing today is I'm pulling from 6 different projects across that region. And we have Ute rock or Ute components on a lot of sites, but really what I'm going to be talking about is the rock art in particular. Some of those projects focused on detailed illustration of Ute rock art. And yeah, 23 of the panels had Ute rock art elements. So we have really intensive detailed information on some of the rock art in the region. The most important areas for Ute rock art, I would say, are the San Juan River, which runs east to west across southeast Utah. We also have Cottonwood Wash, and Cottonwood Wash runs from the Abajo Mountains south to the San Juan River and dumping into it around Bluff, Utah. And then the other canyon system would be Indian Creek, and that is on the northern side of the Abajos. And that runs north from the Abajo Mountains to join the Colorado River in basically Canyonlands National Park. So these canyon settings with perennial water were and are immensely important places for the Ute. So these riparian settings supported all sorts of plants and shrubs and trees that the Utes used for food, medicine, tools, clothing, and shelter. The hunting was really good in these riparian zones. But even more than that, the canyon systems themselves provided direct corridors to hunting along larger river areas and up into the high country, into the mountains. So they also became even more important when the Ute adopted horses, because you just need consistent and reliable water sources when you have large herds. So I'm using the term Ute for this talk, but I really need to recognize right off the bat that that term encompasses many different loosely knitted but distinct Ute bands and Southern Paiute groups in the region during the late prehistoric and protohistoric period. So despite 800 years of occupation in the Four Corners, the archaeological footprint of these people is really ephemeral and almost impossible to parse apart between those different groups. I don't know if anyone's seen Jay Willen's talks over the last couple of years, but he's really made the point that even though we have pictures of Ute encampments of hundreds of people, when we go back and do archaeological surveys in those areas, we find almost no materials left behind by those groups. So an example would be just a few small teepee rings that maybe you could identify because they are in a circular shape, a few rocks in a circular shape in the right diameter. So very hard to distinguish where these Ute groups are. Another example that Woods Canyon has recorded over the last couple of years is a giant mile-long antelope game drive. And you can see it, the map on the left there, and then the low fence over to the right. So yeah, large game drives or cottonwood style projectile points would be another example of that. But past that, it is definitely hard to identify Ute occupation in Southeast Utah. So instead, it is really Ute rock art that holds the most substantial and tangible information on the Ute occupation and experience in the region. Incredibly, these petroglyphs really trace the Ute from their roots as sort of undifferentiated Southern Numic speakers, hunter and gatherers that migrated to the region to assertively self-identified, reservation-defined tribal entities. So today I'm going to explore that 800 years of Ute history in Southeast Utah through what I believe is temporally distinct Ute imagery. Just a little bit on our methods when it comes to intensive rock art documentation. So Woods Canyon uses a variety of methods to record rock art. High definition photography and photogrammetry are really important, along with scaled hand drawings. So I say that because we still insist on illustrating panels in the field, not because they're perfect, images of what we're seeing, but it's because of all the information that we extract when we really spend time in place in front of those that rock art. Things like superimposition of different elements, which came first, is really important, and also the patination levels. So how much patination is on the panel can really tell us which elements are probably proto-historic or contact period Ute versus deep history prehistoric rock art depictions. So I'm going to dive right in and start at what I think is the beginning. And this is probably, I'm stepping out on a limb in some of this, but I want to talk about what I think are possible prehistoric styles dating from AD 1300 to 1600 that may be associated with Ute occupation. The first style is what I would describe as an incised line style that we've recorded over and over again in the canyon systems. As you can see, these incised style is often used to depict plants, but also people on the landscape. There's several of those, and also we get animals, so probably something that looks like maybe a deer and other figures that are in this incised design style. Now you might be asking me, why do I think this is Ute in particular? I think, like the incised designs that you can see on this large panel, I see the incised work as far less patinated than some of the other elements, which I can attribute to ancestral Pueblo periods. And especially, I think there might be if I go to the zoom in, yeah, up on the upper middle left is what I think is probably a sandal design, Pueblo 3 sandal design from that is attributed to ancestral Pueblo people. And all of those other incised designs are far less patinated. Now, I should say that I've shown these incised designs to Sally Cole, who is a rock art specialist in the region. And she really believes that the incised designs are part of a continuous practice on the Colorado Plateau that date all the way back to the Archaic period, and that it wasn't introduced during the Ute period in particular. But I also would like to say that I think that even if that is the case, I think that that the Ute, early Ute occupants actually adopted this style, as they did with other earlier styles. So they certainly copied some of the other images. And I want to say that like on this rock art panel here, what the Ute are doing is coming back and expanding on the stories that are already there. And a lot of times actually taking on or replicating the styles that they see. So you've got like these large archaic like bighorn sheep on the left, and the ones that I've circled in red are Ute additions to the panel itself. Another pretty clear Ute addition to many panels is bear prints. Bear prints, I haven't seen full-blown bears like are seen in other regions, but a lot of bear prints that are less patinated. I would say that this has been tracked by both Linda McNeil and Carol Patterson, who have done a lot of work in other regions with Ute rock art. And they both argued that depictions of bears and bear prints is a direct reference to longstanding practices like the bear dance or bear renewal ceremonies in the spring.
Excuse me, Shanna.
Yes.
I know we were going to take questions at the end, but I got one that might be good to take now.
Sure.
And it said, can you define incised versus other ways of creating petroglyphs?
Yeah, absolutely. So incised is going to be a line that is, I keep wanting to use the word incised, but it is deeply grooved into the rock surface. So we have incised, and then we would have abraded, which is rubbed. So you'd get a smooth surface. There's pecked, and there's also scratched. So those are all the different types of petroglyphs that we would be parsing out. There's also pictographs, but I haven't found any evidence of painted Ute rock art, although we do have some charcoal images that I'll be talking about later on. So the Utes also added symbolism, symbolism and figures to earlier panels. So what you're looking at here again is that abraded large bighorn sheep that's in the background, which it probably dates the Archaic period. So we're talking before 0 AD. And then we've got all this overlay, almost all those other figures are Fremont figures that are packed over the top of that. And then I have this very lightly patinated figures, which I've circled in red there. And you can see one of them kind of looks like a shield figure, and the other one is a full-blown figure that tries to replicate the Fremont figures on the panel, except there's addition of sort of legs and sort of longer headdress stuff coming off of that figure. So I think with that said, I just have to point out that a lot of the Ute anthropomorphs that we've been documenting, I can tell that they're Ute just by style and patination, but they are very much referencing and modeling themselves after Fremont rock art that is already on those panels. I would say most of the figures, Ute figures we record are Fremont style. And sometimes there's even a level of revitalization that goes on. This is another not illustrated, we haven't digitally illustrated this one, but it is along the same lines where the figure to the left is a Ute figure. And you can see that addition of longer arms, fingers, and a little bit different headdress, but it's very Fremont-like, where you get the bighorn sheep and some of the other dots to the right are probably deeply archaic, and even what we would call Grand Canyon linear figures. So when you people are coming back to these areas, they are adding themselves to the history of what is already there. And they're doing that with a Fremont flavor. So this is where I might, I go against the grain a little bit, because historically archaeologists have made the case that the Fremont disappeared from Utah in the 13th century. There's even been DNA studies that were done to prove that the Utes are not descended from the Fremont, that there's not a biological connection, but those samples, I would argue that those samples are really small, and they were done like over 20 years ago now. Instead, researchers have argued that the Fremont were just simply pushed to the north of the entire, their historic territory, that they migrated south to join Pueblo people, or just that they simply died out and were replaced by the Ute when they made it into the area. Other archaeologists, and this is more recent, I think there's a lot of research heading this direction. Other archaeologists posit that at least some Fremont people were subsumed into Ute populations when they flooded into the territory in the 13th century, just as the Fremont disappeared. So as Sandra Jones pointed out, I just want to say that reference to a racially pure Ute tribe is maybe a modern overlay that we add to our interpretation of the Ute. And until really the 17th century, Ute identity was not something that was a construct of race, but really a construct of culture. So what I see in the rock art is a strong affiliation by the Ute with their Fremont predecessors. And I just think we should continue to consider that there may be Fremont that were subsumed or that abandoned and let go of their agricultural practices and joined sort of the Utes in their hunting and gather lifestyle. And I'll give a couple reasons. One, that really recent Ute studies have pushed back Ute occupation to the 13th century and shown that Fremont, and other research has shown that Fremont were still living in the region during that exact same century. So there would have been literally interaction between these populations. Both societies were diverse with varying adaptations to their lifeways. So if you have an example like in the Great Basin, both the Ute and the Fremont had fishing populations, or in the mountains, hunting and gathering populations, or small game and gathering populations in the low desert. So some of their lifeways really overlapped. And then my final argument is that Ute occupants of Cedar Mesa certainly thought of themselves as related to the Fremont based on the fact that they keep revitalizing Fremont figures and depicting themselves in the same regalia and dress. So I think we need to listen to the early Ute, that they are very much connected to and believe themselves as part of that Fremont descendancy. So when not referencing or depicting themselves as sort of Fremont, I just wanted to show you examples of Ute anthropomorphs that are not in sort of Fremont looking design or regalia. So we see probably actual individuals or maybe even supernatural beings in some of the anthropomorphs on Ute panels. This depiction shows a range of wide square-bodied figures with their arms up or out. We can tell the panel is Ute, again, because of its lack of patination, sort of the design of the bodies, and the knee-length fringed buckskin shirt worn by the middle figure on the left, which is very much a Ute garb. Ute mythology, I would say, is filled with everything from giants to dangerous water babies that live in rivers and good and bad dwarf spirits. So I would say that researchers have just only started to unpack the cultural symbolism depicted in early Ute rock art. And I think it is a rich area for future research. So just to throw that out there. The Ute bands living in the Four Corners probably heard the news, if not even witnessed, Juan de Oñate's entrada into the Southwest in 1598. So the entrada made it as far north as San Juan Pueblo along the Chama River, which is just on the southern boundary of Ute territory. But no matter what, there was they definitely came in contact with Spanish fairly quickly. In 1637, the Spanish pushed into the San Luis Valley looking for gold. And there is a story that the Utes spread the message of what they thought was this invasion with smoke signals and actually attacked that Spanish entrada. It was a pretty terrible battle, and the Spanish took hundreds of Ute prisoners and marched them back to Santa Fe. Most of them were conscripted into slavery, and several of them were sent as far south as Mexico City. Interestingly, there's documentation that 3 years later, there were Utes that escaped Santa Fe, and they returned to their bands with horses. So it was the first horses that were introduced into Ute culture. The Utes eventually helped the Pueblos oust the Spanish during the Pueblo Revolt. So helped push them out for that period in 1680. But ironically, when the Spanish returned 12 years later, they found that horse-mounted Utes were already raiding places like Hopi and other Pueblos. So once the introduction of the horse came into Ute society, it was very quickly adapted, and the Utes strongly affiliated with their mounted lifestyle. So the earliest known records of European contact with indigenous inhabitants in the Four Corners were Juan Maria de Rivera, who explored the region during 2 expeditions in the late 1700s. And then, of course, we have the Dominguez and Escalante trip through the area. They both talked about the Ute, or what they were calling them the Saboganas at the time. And we've got Rivera mentioning the Ute is very shy, hunting and gathering population, or root eaters is what he called them. But by the time the Dominguez and Escalante expedition came through, there were stories of the Utes stealing horses and that they were mounted and dangerous. So it was a very quick transition in that late 1700s. Probably the best example of Spanish period rock art by the Utes was a newspaper rock panel. So this is a 3D image of the panel that I created when we documented it about 2 years ago. Of course, newspaper rock is famous for including rock art that spans several thousands of years, from archaic all the way through Ute and into the historic period. We've got ancestral Pueblo represented, Fremont styles, and those predate the Ute. But when we hand illustrated the panel as part of a BLM initiative in Indian Creek, we were able to parse out the temporal affiliation of each element based on its style, patination, association. And we were finished, it was clear that 90% of the rock art on newspaper rock is attributable to early Ute occupation during that Spanish period. So here is our entire illustration of newspaper rock, and you can see there's about 834 elements. And this is a depiction when I drop the earlier temporal designs into the background. So they're still there, but they're shaded into the background. And you can see that there's 684 elements that look like they are Ute period. So when Polly Shasma studied newspaper rock in the 1990s, she estimated that the Ute portion of the panel really dated from 1700 to 1750. And I certainly agree that it dates to this early Spanish period, and that maybe it was even created slightly earlier than that in the late 1600s. So some of the diagnostic elements include things like the prevalence of horses, but a lack of guns. And you can see that figure on the right is riding a horse, but he has no saddle, which the Utes were riding bareback for quite a while. And he is fighting with a bow and arrow. And then there is, on the left, you can see what Polly Shasma identified as that figure with the horns and the fringed pants that he's wearing as sort of fringed buckskin chaps. He's also carrying something that looks like a Spanish quirt or horsewhip. So these are the things that really identify it as a Spanish period panel. So the consistency in style, patination, and layout really says that the newspaper rock Ute components were created in maybe one event, or at least a very short period of time. So this fact makes the newspaper rock an important snapshot of Ute identity during that Spanish time. And again, Fremont emulation is really big. Those figures on the left, you can see that there was a true Fremont anthropomorph in the upper left, and the Utes came back and just repacked or packed a foot on top of him, but then they added their own figures in very much a Fremont emulation style. So on the right, you can see that there are other things that are more focused on Ute culture. And I would argue that some of that is wearing full skins. So maybe that long figure even wearing a skin of possibly a mountain lion or other creature, and wearing sort of feathered or horned headdresses, which is common in Ute dress. And the fringed chaps, again, would be an indicator of Ute culture at the time. We also know that, with the introduction of the horse, the Ute had really expanded their hunting range. So they were covering huge territories, moving not only annually, but exploiting all of these high, middle, and low elevation territories in probably over hundreds of miles. So even although the Spanish, what you see here is that we've got a lot of different game depicted on newspaper rock, and that includes everything from local game like deer, elk, bighorn, beaver, even pronghorn antelope that would have been fairly accessible. But if you look at that middle left panel, what you see is buffalo, so bison, and possibly even a moose depicted. And those would have been accessible probably in the Uinta Basin, if not even closer at the time. So we had huge buffalo herds everywhere through, North Park, South Park, Middle Park, and the San Luis Valley, possibly all the way over in the Grand Junction area, and definitely north of that in the Uinta Basin. So I have to touch on the horse again, because it is such a huge component of Ute culture during that early contact period. So although Spanish law forbade Indians from owning horses in the 17th century, Utes acquired them in spades. So as early as 1626, they were stealing them, recovering strays, buying old worn out horses as fast as they could. And really by 1640, the knowledge of equestrianism had spread, and the Spanish were describing the Utes as mounted Indians with a hunter-warrior sort of complex that they were following. So the Utes were among the first indigenous groups to acquire and master the horse. And this really contributed to their remarkable success for about 100 years. As Ute bands became adept and skilled riders, the horse was an integral part of every part of their lives. Horses were one of their most prized possessions, and were a principal symbol of wealth and pride. Through both trade and theft, they got them, really, they were able to collect herds that were hundreds of horses at a time. Utes often rode bareback, as I was mentioning, or they used just leather pads with short stirrups. And these special stirrups hung from the horse's mane and allowed riders to drop to one side and shoot from underneath the horse's belly during battle. So they became these sort of the epitome of that hunter warrior mounted, not planes necessarily at the time, but a component of very strong and dominant, terrified other local groups at the time. So with their capability for both raiding and capturing other groups and expanding their hunting territory. Utes were a fairly feared and powerful tribe. So they carried out raids in northern New Mexico throughout the 17th and 18th century. They stole horses from the Spaniards, and they stole from the Pueblo people, Jicarillas, Apaches, the Navajos to the southwest, and they also raided several of these groups, like the Western Shoshone and Southern Paiutes, capturing women and children, which they traded to the Spanish in New Mexico for use as domestic workers and shepherds. So these images that I'm showing you here are from newspaper rock, and especially that one on the right, I think probably depicts Ute raiding, and possibly someone who's carrying a child in their arms, maybe as they gathered women and children to trade into the Spanish economic system. So for 200 years, the Spanish tried to limit the Utes' trade and exposure to outside people because they were such a powerful group with such a large and a huge economic partner. They were very important. But eventually, trade restrictions were relaxed in the early 1800s, and the Utes were gradually able to interact with more outsiders. With Mexico's independence in 1821, Ute territory was opened up. The barn doors were thrown open in a lot of ways, and their entire territory was opened up to trappers, miners, and settlement encroachment. As they competed for bison hunting territory and sort of even just economic dominance when it came to bison populations and in raiding populations, the Utes really started to compete with a lot of the Plains tribes. And through that, they fought both against government powers over the next century, and that helped them develop what turned into sort of a Plains warfare complex. So they were transformed from sort of small mounted raiding groups into well-coordinated cavalry attacks with sort of a Plains overlay. So you can see from this reproduction of the 1880s lithograph that the Utes by that point had adopted teepees and feathered headdresses into their everyday use wear. So the great part is that creates a really diagnostic symbol that we can see in rock art. And Woods Canyon has recorded at least 5 Ute figures in feather headdresses with associated sort of Plains regalia. These 2 figures were depicted on the exact same site, and I should add that this is a really large Pueblo site, but with the addition of these Ute figures, they are really interacting with that Pueblo space. So the figure on the left is about half life size, and it's on a rock face next to the floodplain, so really low on the site. 30 meters above and on a separate cliff band is the figure on the right, which is only about 30 centimeters tall, so fairly small. But though separated, these figures seem to reference each other and could possibly be seen at the same time from the valley floor when they were first packed. Winter encampments also really grew with Ute adoption of horses and their mobility. So it's been described that Ute became really fine horsemen with vast herds And this allowed them to spend their wintertime in canyon country next to water in particular, with encampments of more than 200 lodges at a time. So of course, they had to be in places where there was consistent water for those horse herds, but places like the San Juan River, Cottonwood Wash, and Indian Creek were just absolutely ideal for these winter camps. You can see that's sort of a depiction of a Ute wiki up on the left. Of course, they also had teepees at the time. And we found depictions of both in the rock art in these canyon systems. And we've recorded probably 10 different rock art panels with sort of scratched or lightly scratched depictions of Ute camps. And some of them had more than a dozen wiki-ups in the scene at a time. So they're strikingly different than what we're seeing in the other types of Ute rock art. So these are quickly produced in right next to probably where the camps were. And this is me just throwing it out there, but I feel like sort of the location and style of this rock art is so different that maybe it was women that were creating these. Women that were spending a lot of time at those camps were creating depictions of those encampments rather than men. Here's just another example of possibly teepees and wiki-up drawings next to waterways in the canyon country. So with the end of the Mexican-American War in 1848 and the subsequent transfer of Alta California to the United States, drastic encroachment on Utes territory really ensued. And I think people have marked this as the beginning of the end for Ute sovereignty in the region. Before this time period, French, Canadians, and American trappers had already made their way into Ute territory, and they were looking for beaver and otters and furs. The Utes really put up with them, but they didn't have a major impact on Ute culture at the time. And in fact, there were many Utes that dabbled in sort of trapping themselves. In 1885, the Mormons and other cattle ranchers moved into the area, and they did that in a big way. And what they brought with them was cattle ranching. So this portrait on a cliff face in Indian Creek was painted in 1885, and it was painted by someone from the Heartland, Vermont Cattle Company. And they were out of Vermont, which, believe it or not, that meant this cattle company loaded both cattle and themselves onto trains, shipped them to probably the Grand Junction area, unloaded them, and tried to run a herd in Indian Creek. Right smack in the dab middle of Ute territory. This endeavor only lasted about 5 years, but it's an example of the type of encroachment that really ended Ute isolation. Adding to this was additional traffic brought on by people traveling the Spanish Trail, which one line of the Spanish Trail travels right through Southeast Utah. On its way to California. And while it provided the Utes new opportunities for trading and looting and maybe cattle rustling, the trail also opened up their traditional territory to a flood of newcomers seeking land and resources. Trading posts were opened, and Euro-American trade goods became a real part of Ute landscape during this time. And skirmishes in all out warfare with Mormons, other settlers, and the government, the US government, were nearly constant during the next 50 years. I should add that there were times where the Utes were actually conscripted and joined the US in warfare or attacks on other groups. They were used even all the way up through the Civil War. The Ute were helped the United States government fight off the Confederacy. So they were constantly used as for their military prowess at the same time that they were being restricted into smaller and smaller territories and forced into more of an American lifeway. So all the while they had to adjust and cope with, disposition of their lands, restrictions, and demands on their allegiance, along with assimilation. The women Utes were really known to reject and fight every restriction of their territory right up to the Posey War in the 1920s. But what we see in the rock art doesn't really tell that whole history. What we see is not that frenetic military and conflict, but instead, a lot of this late Ute rock art depicts mostly scenes from everyday life. I really love this, this depiction in particular, because it is a combination of really late Ute styles all the way through early styles and sort of Ute life during that American period. So you can see that there's sort of these figures on the lower left that are still sort of referencing Fremont style headdresses and anthropomorphs, maybe Fremont symbolism. But at the same time, we have that Ute gentleman on a horse, and he's wearing his flat hat, maybe wearing a blanket over him. And one other component is sort of the dots of circles that are around him and to the left with all those scratched lines. And what I think those are is plan view perspectives on possibly territory or a corral, and the one on the left is a wiki up or teepee. So plan view maps are known to be part of the Ute rock art sort of language. And Carol Patterson has talked about that and documented that quite a bit in the Uncompahgre region. So this panel in particular combines all sorts of aspects of early Ute, middle Ute, and very late Ute stylistic rock art depictions. Also carried on with sort of that, instead of incising, we've got just very light line styles in charcoal, but they look like those early incised style depictions. This is a rock art panel that is down at Barton Trading Post, which is right next to the San Juan River. And it's right next to, I think that it's really late and dates along with that Barton Trading Post, because during that time, the Trading Post actually created and built some wiki-ups for Utes to stay at during their visits to the Trading Post. So we've got sort of Ute overlay right next to modern trading facilities. The late Ute rock art really depicts a lot of women's lives, which we don't see very much of in some of the earlier styles. And this is very simplified drawing of something that I think is really important. And that dress I have circled there is a Ute style dress that was pecked very late. We can tell by the patination, but it is depicted in the middle of a rock art panel that has basket maker 2 style female petroglyphs on it. So what you see to the right and left of that dress are sort of the triangles and sort of these arcs. Those are what is left of females depicted on this panel. And there is a lineup of 30 of those women at that panel. And this Ute dress is put right in the middle of that. So it's, again, it's Utes, and in this case, women, talking about their relationship to people that occupied the land 2,000 years before they were there. We also have this very important panel called the Cradleboard Site, and that depicts a full-blown infant in a Ute cradleboard and its mother probably kneeling next to it. So we can tell that it's Ute by the way the baby is tied into that cradleboard and sort of the weaving wicker work that's shown on the top of the cradleboard itself. And the last I want to talk about is sort of family life portrayals that show up in Ute rock art. So as it's progressing, Ute rock art is getting more and more realistic in style, sort of that 19th century look to its depictions. And what is showing up is family life in particular. I'm using this photo because it's actually Chipita, who is not Ute, but she grew up in a Ute family. She's northern Rio Grande Pueblo, and her brother, John McCook, who is Ute, that she raised. So again, it kind of throws our ideas about Ute family life. It's far more intricate and varied than we would like to overlay with our sort of Western ideas about a nuclear family. So just as I show these other images, keep that in mind. We've got sort of inscribed styles of Utes in some of the canyon systems. So probably men on the right with their flat hats and women in dresses on the left. But again, everyone's still wearing slightly either horned or feathered headdresses, which reference sort of that idea of Fremont connections still even in the late period. And then we've got depictions of maybe husband and wife or sister and brother or some other sort of connection in really very realistic depictions on some of the canyon walls. And I'm going to bring back that the feathered headdress warrior that I showed earlier, and he's actually depicted right next to this to this couple on the right. And I don't really know enough to confirm this, but I almost wonder if this is a depiction of the bear dance itself, where women and men, women pick dance partners at the ceremony and dance with men, and the headdressed warrior on the right is carrying something that looks a lot like the rasp musical instruments that are used during the bear dance. So I want to say that really what is known as the Posey War in 1923 brought Ute access to a lot of Southeast Utah to a close. It was sort of the final end of the Utes' fight for access to their full territory in Southeast Utah and to all of these canyon settings. So after the skirmishes over law and land, sort of the imprisonment of many white Mesa Utes in Blanding and the death of Posey himself, the white Mesa Ute agreed to detached allotments in Cottonwood Wash and to stay on their reservation on the Mesa south of Blanding. So I really feel after that point, some of these canyon systems become places of history and myth, even for people, even for you people that grew up going to them quite a bit. they take on a whole different feel rather than a constant place of where you would gather resources, plants, animals, full hunting capacity. They become places of visitation and maybe periodic gathering, but they're not the landscapes where people live anymore. So as I just wanted to show this map to just for us all to recognize that you know, Utah and Colorado were Ute territory on a very large landscape. And where we are today is that we've borrowed and incorporated a lot of Ute culture into our concepts of who we are as Coloradans or Utahns. You know, place names, even the trails that we walk, the highways that we drive are Ute routes, sort of how we see the West and its development. All of that is incorporated through the concept of Ute history. So in a way, we are all looking at this as places of sort of myth and mythology at this time. As Robert McPherson recounted in his book through interviews with White Mesa Ute elders, Ute petroglyphs should be protected because they represent a bridge from yesterday's teachings to today's generation. They're very important locations. So this petroglyph in particular, there's a story about it that it depicts a mounted warrior that slew a giant serpent with his bow. And this serpent was terrorizing people up and down Cottonwood Wash, and it preyed on their weak and their young for many years. And this warrior, when they called to him, came, slew the serpent and told the Ute of the area that if you never need help again, that he would return to help them. So again, there is a larger picture and an important sense of continuity that this rock art depicts. So just to summarize some of the rock art style that I was talking about and their sequences before I log off. I just want to point out that we've got what I think is an early incised line style that might be early Ute. We get more of a peck design style, and that comes with a lot of Fremont overlay and reference. And as Ute culture is exposed to outside territories and they adopt the horse, a whole different economic system, and then through encroachment by especially white American and Mormon settlers, their depictions become more realistic and lifelike through time. So I hope that some of these stylistic markers might help us as archaeologists as we move forward. And with that contribution, we're able to open the doors up to the Ute living in the region for help with their interpretations and identifying and helping them explain how deeply rooted their culture is in this territory. So thank you very much. And I just want to say thank you again to the BLM Monticello field office that invited me to share with all of you and the Edge of Cedars lecture series. This work would not have been possible without Friends of Cedar Mesa. They're a nonprofit out of Bluff, Utah that we've been working really closely with, and they've contributed everything from funding to personnel and volunteers for a lot of the rock art documentation. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Shanna. That was a fascinating presentation, and I just learned a tremendous amount. And thank you also for your acknowledgements that I didn't get into my introduction. We have over 20 questions, so I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to them all. It's already after 5 o'clock, but let's get started and do as many as we can and move through them as best we can. Somebody asked, could you mention the difference in tools used in pecked versus incised, the creation of pecked versus incised rock art?
Okay, well, we do know that material-wise, it's very hard to find production elements when you're looking at these archaeology sites, but just from the depictions themselves, we know that pecked is probably, they're using a harder material than the sandstone, so maybe a quartzite or igneous element to create those percussion depressions in the rock face itself. While incised, you can almost use anything on sandstone, even wood, to groove those designs into the rock face itself.
You mentioned that there weren't as many pictographs. I guess the charcoal images would count as pictographs. What is the frequency and the design variation in Ute pictographs?
From Southeast Utah, that's what I know of. There is quite a bit of other, what we call proto-historic or contact period pictographs, but those are almost all attributed to Navajo. Early Navajo occupants. So in Ute depictions, I see almost primarily petroglyphs, and like you pointed out, Mark, it's charcoal designs, if anything.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Not everybody gets our jargon, and somebody asked, what is meant by patination?
So patina is something that develops on sandstone rock faces. And it's a combination, it's that really dark looking glossy stuff that's on maybe a cliff face. And that develops from the interaction between the minerals and the biotics that are living on that surface. And it's a buildup of sort of magnesium that is left on that surface. So it's great when we've got a lot of it. People in the past love to peck things into that because it really stands out when you peck into patinated surface.
Thank you. That's great. Great definition of that. I got a good question. Have you had the chance to talk to Ute people about their view on whether their ancestry is connected to Fremont people?
The only person that I've heard from and would be Terry Knight, who is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Ute Mountain Ute, and he would say, of course, we are connected to Fremont populations. That is kind of outside of my sphere right now, but I know there's a lot of discussion on it, and I hope that going forward, there's more collaboration on that front for interpretation of sort of early occupation in the region.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd like to be involved in that myself. What about the relationship between basket maker and early Ute? Did they overlap in time, or if they didn't even overlap in time in their occupations of the area, does Ute rock art ever interact with basket maker rock art?
They do, and in other talks, I've actually argued this, that as archaeologists, we love our boxes, but we've sort of, we've disassociated basket maker, which especially what we call basket maker 2, which is 500 BC to 500 AD, who are in this region, and especially Southeast Utah. We've disassociated them from Fremont people, and then we've disassociated Fremont people from Ute. But what I've seen in the canyons of Southeast Utah, Ute occupants are definitely referencing that very early occupation. And, I was talking a lot about Fremont headdresses and Fremont symbology. almost all of that symbology actually can be traced back to what would be called basket maker style rock art.
Right.
So, you know, in a lot of ways, we've taken a modern population and really removed them from discussions of what should happen on the landscape because we've disassociated them from that deep history.
Yeah, right. For Fremont people and culture, is their rock art a principal record of their occupation, similar to what you've argued for the Ute?
Absolutely. Fremont they were very light on the landscape, just like the Ute. We do get granaries because they grew corn, they were agricultural, but they were also, there was highly adapted versions where maybe they just fished or hunted and not necessarily were growing corn. So we get very little left behind by Fremont people, just like the Ute, but Fremont rock art can be really expressive, and it is the thing that we're able to track the most easily for Fremont populations.
Thank you very much. So I have a question that says, I know this sounds strange, but I have a reason for asking. Have you seen any evidence of Ute having a connection to people in Peru?
No, not that I know of, but you know, I don't really know a lot of, I don't know if you have any answers to that, Mark.
Well, maybe that person can contact you and tell you their reason for having that curiosity. They obviously have a reason. I might botch this question, but I'll do my best. And I have to get a little closer because the typing is small. Have you heard the Numic word topet copy? I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Described by Stoffel and Van Veek as a knotted string. And is it related to the rake petroglyph? And I think she saw an image that she thought was a knotted spring that looked like a rake petroglyph. So I'm not sure what she means by the rake petroglyph or the knotted string, but I'll throw that out to you.
You know, I would love to, if you're spotting anything that is identifiable, especially in sort of Numic culture, or you know, what I'm really interested is early Numic culture in the Great Basin and connections to what we're seeing here. That would be great. I'm not necessarily a Ute expert in this region, and especially when it comes to the Numic language, I don't know, but I love that someone's bringing that up.
Yeah, and they can contact you. We can, maybe Taylor can help put that together to where y'all can talk.
I will be sending out Shanna's email after the event today.
Thank you very much, Taylor. Do you see much similarity between Southern Paiute images in California and Ute images in Utah?
You know, to some degree, and I think some of that linear stuff in particular, but again, I am not really versed in Great Basin or Southern Paiute early work. So it's something that I'm really interested in, but I don't know necessarily.
Thank you. Do you think Ute images easily adopted Fremont imagery because they share the Uto-Aztecan language? Perhaps they regarded them as cousins, linguistic cousins?
Well, and you know, Mark, you might even be able to chime in on this, but there's a lot of people that argue that, well, that the Fremont were speaking Kiowa. I think other people have argued that there was early Hopi speakers, which are Uto-Aztecan. So there is a possibility we've got that linguistic connection. What we don't know, because we haven't identified modern populations that are Fremont, is exactly what they spoke. But symbolically, I could certainly see that as an expansion of linguistics moving into sort of your symbolic language.
So a couple of things I would mention in that regard is the Fremont archaeological area. That's an archaeological concept of an area within which there's a roughly shared material culture. But it covers a huge area, and almost certainly has more than one linguistic group. So Scott Ortman has made a compelling argument that some Fremont people were Kiowa speakers, which is not a Uto-Aztecan language. It's a Kiowa-Tanoan language. But there could have been other Uto-Aztecan speakers that were part of the Fremont culture area. And I would recommend the book by David Schall, the linguist, which is the prehistory of Western North America, the impact of Uto-Aztecan languages. And he actually discusses like shared words between Ute and Hopi, which are both different Uto-Aztecan languages, et cetera. And that would be a good resource for this person to go to.
Yeah.
I got a question that would be really, oh, I'm sorry, let me go.
Sorry, I was just going to mention that Linda McNeil, who she's partnered with Robert Shaw, she has an article out there that actually talks about breaking down Fremont linguistics and that connection with early Uto-Aztecan language groups too.
And I think she links some of that rock art to Hopi, Fremont rock art to Hopi. Yeah. I'm not, I would have to go back and reread that article. This is probably a question that we should leave and not answer and have a Ute person answer, but did some Utes become Comanches?
Yeah, I think that's a better question for, and there's so many different Ute bands too, and a really complex history. But there was definitely a lot of interaction, not necessarily by the Wiminuche or Southern Utes over here, but further towards the plains in the San Luis Valley in particular.
What evidence or interpretation factors that affect interpretation suggest whether men or women made petroglyphs, not just in Ute panels, but in any rock art?
I think, you know, I've talked about this before, but we have to be very careful, especially when it comes to gender, because we can get this sort of black and white. So being very careful when we say it's male or female, but we can rely on culturally appropriate symbolism, such as the cradle board is very much a motherly association with a child, or maybe male warfare. We know that in Ute culture, male and female genders were very dichotomous. So that is helpful when we're interpreting sort of panels. But, you know, I rely on dress, association, and symbolism.
So I have a question that I'm not sure I'm reading right, and I'm not sure I can ask it right, but I'll go ahead and try, and maybe we can connect you with this person. It's please comment on figures of anthros riding animals other than horses in Ute iconography. So I'm not sure if the anthros means people riding things other than horses.
Sure.
Is there anything?
You know, and that's another one of those assumptions is a lot of times when I see a person riding a quadruped in Ute rock art, I assume that it's a horse, but maybe that isn't particularly the case. But it would be very difficult. I think there's donkeys. Donkeys played a really large role, but I have never heard of major other beasts of burden that the Utes were using in particular. They were just so very attached to their horses in particular.
Thank you. Can you explain the process you use to photograph the cattle ranch pictograph?
The cattle ranch, maybe newspaper rock, or
I don't know. Was it the French one that looked like a D-stretch image?
Oh, yeah, that was a D-stretch. So that was a very, so D-stretch is a free application that you can get like on your phone or your computer. And I think it was developed by a guy who did sonograms on internal organs, but it was for him to try to differentiate very slight changes in imagery. And so it's just a quick, you can do it in Photoshop or other things, but D-stretch is an easy way to to take a flat image and then parse it out into different color spectrums so that you can see it in certain ways and make certain types of images pop out.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And I just downloaded it a couple months ago, and there is a small fee for it now. It used to be free, but he requests a small, but it's totally reasonable. And boy, you can see things that you just can't see with your eyes without it. So did Utes ever live underground prior to the teepee?
No, not that I know of, and especially such a nomadic population. You can see some of those wiki-ups. So maybe during major mobile periods where you're going to harvest pinyon nuts or on a particular hunt, you could have a wiki-up that goes up for a day or two. So incredibly mobile population, almost no long-term structures. And in fact, there's stories about Utes coming back to a place where maybe a wiki-up stood from the year before. And instead of using it again, they dismantle it and rebuild another one. So they're not reoccupying these places, and they're not occupying them for very long. So shelter was something that was just like food. You'd have it for a day and move on.
So somebody wants to know, thank you. Somebody wants to know if you have papers or publications on this topic, and if so, can they read them? And maybe that's a way, you could say it now, but maybe that's a way people can connect to you with email as well and ask you that question. Do you have things?
I haven't, this is really my first foray, and I just felt it was very important to get these images out there because so few people really think of Southeast Utah and the connections with Ute populations that were here. I don't have anything right now, but I might down the line. That's something more formal. This was all built out of baseline inventories. And I will say that we are going to be, that there's a lot of collaboration that will probably happen in the future. Like there's a Ute ethnographic project that is being undertaken by Living Heritage Anthropology right now that will probably be looking at this material down the line. There's other ethnographic projects that are happening, maybe collaborative management in the Bears Ears National Monument that is in this region. So in some ways, I feel that I am providing these images so that they can be incorporated into Ute documents down the line rather than something that I'm developing myself. But yeah, as Mark says, you can, Taylor will share my email after this is over, but you can find me at Woods Canyon Archaeological Consultants. I think my email is online there, but it's basically Shanna at woodscanyon.net. So feel free to contact me.
Somebody says it seems like Numic people were very prolific in rock art. Is there any thoughts to why they were compared to other and earlier groups? Or do you think that's even true, that they were more prolific rock art makers than other and earlier groups?
I don't think that they were necessarily more prolific, except in the case of newspaper rock, which is just which is a state park. It's also on the National Register of Historic Places. If you haven't gone there, go. It's such an incredible experience. What surprised me most is that Ute people interacted with so many other types of rock art in particular. So that idea that they were constantly expanding on the imagery that was already there and connecting with people from the past is what was surprising. I don't think they made more of it, but they definitely interacted with it more than other groups.
Well, that's something I really learned tonight. I had no idea that newspaper rock, which I've looked at many times, was that dominantly Ute. That's great. You okay to keep going? People are starting to sign off, but we still have over 100 on. why do you, and there's not that many more, we'll go through them quickly. Any thoughts about how natural cracks in the rock integrate into the petroglyph panels?
And I don't know if you noticed that in some of the cases. Sometimes I felt that natural cracks divided sort of the Ute numic sort of styles from other styles. Like maybe there's a version where they're contrasting themselves. And another thing I didn't bring up is that Utes definitely have an idea of it's not underworlds like you would consider the Pueblo conceiving of them, but lower and higher worlds. And a lot of times that is in imagery of rainbows. So rainbows show up a lot, and the idea of like higher elevation, animals or plants being higher in the panel versus lower elevation sort of materials. So that was really interesting too, just conceptually seeing that layered on top of each other.
So I know there's people that are really interested in whether rock art sites also have acoustic properties. And I think some of them they refer to as echo chambers. Have you noticed that in any of the rock art sites that have images?
I would, again, I think that Newspaper Rock is this perfect example of that. It's a face and then it's got a large overhang ledge. And I think it's just an important location by a spring, this beautiful overhang. And I think sound wise, it would be a perfect place to test out sort of acoustics.
Thank you. That's interesting. Is there a reason why the Ute did not use, say, that wiki up? Was it practical, or was it some sort of part of their belief system?
That's probably a question for someone who has a Ute background rather than me. But I do know that historically they've got they recorded people coming back to the exact same place and not using that same material. I think part of it is logistic. Like, so even teepee poles or wiki up poles would be harvested one year, set aside to dry straight, and then you would come back and probably whatever you had set up last year might you just don't want to reuse that space because it's decomposing or whatever, and you'd set up something new and clean instead.
Two more questions. The first one's mine. A diagnostic artifact for Ute sites that you didn't mention are brownware pottery. Do you see any brownware pottery on the Ute sites that you've documented in southeastern Utah?
No, and I actually, before this talk, I waded through our, what was it, 1,200 sites that we've recorded in Southeast Utah, and we have not found any Ute brownware pottery.
Really,
and that might just be a factor of the way that it was fired and that it decomposes really easily. We haven't found any early Denatah Navajo-ware either in Southeast Utah, where you do find it on the Colorado side, maybe in higher elevations. So I think that could be a factor just of the way that it's lasting, but we are just not seeing it out there on the landscape.
That's really interesting. Okay, last question. This is from somebody that worked with you. And this person asks, was the rock art documentation we did in Cottonwood Canyon 2 years ago Ute?
Yes, some of it. I don't know if you recognize, I don't know who that is, but
it's Bob.
Who is it?
Bob.
Bob. Oh, yeah, Bob, definitely. Trying to think of exact sites, but yes, what's interesting is it's a lot of times, again, it's larger ancestral Pueblo panels, sometimes basket maker era, sometimes Pueblo era, but those are where we're parsing out and finding those Ute elements is right on top of the earlier panels.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Shanna, we had 200 people tuned in at peak talk, and 103 of you are still out there. So
Awesome.
we're really grateful to you for your interest in learning about the human story and about Ute culture. And we're really grateful to you, Shanna, for sharing your knowledge with us. So thank you very much to the people who attended, and especially thanks to you, Shanna.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mark. And thank you, Taylor. I appreciate everyone tuning in. And yeah, don't forget that there's a lot of Ute archaeology out there to consider.
Shanna, click on the chat real quick because a couple of people said hi to you. All right.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
I
We're
will.
going to sign off right about now. Thank
Okay.
you. See you in 2
Thanks.
weeks. Yep.